This is the 17th video of the Forged Fiction series. If you haven't seen the other videos in this series, check out the Forged Fiction playlist on our channel. You can click on the link in the description or click the card in the top right corner of the screen. We have now discussed every Pauline letter, both those that are forgeries and those that are authentic. Out of the 13 letters in the Pauline corpus, 6 are forgeries. There is one more strange letter that is what I would call Paul adjacent, the epistle to the Hebrews. This text has a very interesting history. The authorship of this letter was disputed in the early church, but after a while it was finally added to the canon when the church decided it was, in fact, Pauline. But its authorship has been brought into question since its addition to the canon. To this day, the authorship is highly debated with stringent defenders on each side, but the majority of scholars do not see this letter as Pauline. This letter, unlike the other ones attributed to Paul, doesn't actually claim to be written by him. Some have argued that its Pauline authorship can be concluded from the way it was written in Paul's writing style. This is usually a good way to get a baseline. This letter is much more like 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, and Romans, authentic Paulines, than it is like Ephesians and Colossians, forgeries. Others have argued that it was written to specifically mimic Paul's writing, which is why it seems to fit in so well into the Pauline corpus. Because of this ongoing debate, the text has seen a lot of progress into what is more likely an original reading, but we will spend this time discussing some interesting variants and then one verse in particular that causes problems. But first, did Paul actually write this? Although interesting arguments exist in favor of Pauline authorship, they are either too weak or too complex and lack the necessary evidence. We can tell, however, that the author was in Paul's circle. The language of Hebrews constitutes the finest Greek in the New Testament, far superior to the Pauline standard both in vocabulary and sentence building. The writer's use of imagery is also distinctive. A ship missing the harbor, an anchor gripping the seabed, a double-edged sword that penetrates and divides the inmost faculties of the soul, a wrestler hopelessly exposed in a headlock, fields richly watered by rain and producing useful crops or worthless weeds. All these images are foreign to Pauline usage. The writer moves confidently within the conceptual world of cultic concerns centering in priesthood and sacrifice. Many of the emphases of Hebrews are alien to those of Paul. It's clear the evidence is heavily against Pauline authorship, but I suggest looking this up for yourself and going down the rabbit hole. We can now begin discussing some of the variants. The first rather interesting variation comes in at Hebrews 1:3. The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful word. After he had provided purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty in heaven. The majority of manuscripts in the Byzantine tradition have added a possessive pronoun for clarification on exactly whose sins he has purified. The text had now read, after he had provided purification for our sins. The reason for this change was to differentiate Jesus from the Levitical priests, who would purify their own sins before offering a sacrifice of atonement for the people. Most Bibles have the more likely correct reading without the addition of our, although some still maintain the Byzantine tradition with its inclusion. Sometimes scribes would change the text to make up for what they saw as discrepancies in geography. This was such a case for Hebrews 9:3-4. Behind the second curtain was a room called the Most Holy Place, which had the golden altar of incense and the gold-covered Ark of the Covenant. This ark contained the gold jar of manna, Aaron's staff that had budded, and the stone tablets of the covenant. According to this text, the altar was actually in the Holy of Holies, along with the ark. But this contradicted the Old Testament description of the tabernacle. According to Exodus 36, the altar was to be placed in front of the curtain. Put the altar in front of the curtain that shields the Ark of the Covenant law, before the atonement cover that is over the tablets of the covenant law, where I will meet with you. This led the scribe of Codex Vaticanus and the translator of the Ethiopic version to correct this discrepancy by moving the words to 9:2, where the furniture of the holy place is itemized. We can now discuss the final verse for this video, and the one that is probably the most interesting in this text, Hebrews 2:9. But we do see Jesus, who was made lower than the angels for a little while, now crowned with glory and honor because he suffered death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. This verse in particular is so interesting because of the clash of its internal evidence and external evidence. In previous videos, I've mostly followed external evidence. I have looked at numbers of manuscripts, where they are, how old they are, and which texts are more likely better readings from varying methods of textual criticism. This one is surely a case that can cause us to flip tables. The oldest manuscripts are not necessarily the best. You could have a 3rd century manuscript that was copied from a 1st century manuscript, making it more probably a better reading. But at the same time, you could have a manuscript from 180 CE that was copied from a manuscript from 170, which was copied from a manuscript from 160, and so on. So you could theoretically have dozens of generations of manuscripts in a short time span, and because of this, you could have very inaccurate readings. That's why both internal and external evidence hold weight. In Hebrews 2:9, the clash is strong between these two types of evidence. Although the surviving documents are virtually uniform in stating that Jesus died for all people by the grace of God, chariti theo, the force of internal evidence forces us to read it as apart from God, choris theo, which is poorly attested. Among Greek manuscripts, the latter reading only occurs in 2 of them, both from the 10th century. One of them, however, minuscule 1739, is an oddity among medieval manuscripts. Its author claims to be reproducing a very ancient text, and he even includes the marginal notes from the scribe he's copying from. This, combined with the fact that many early church fathers, such as Ambrose, Jerome, and Origen, noted that apart from God was the reading in most manuscripts of their day, makes this case even more interesting. We have discussed the external evidence on this verse, so we can now discuss the internal evidence. This less attested reading is actually more consistent with the theology of Hebrews. Never in the epistle does the word grace, charis, refer to Jesus' death or to the benefits that result from it. Instead, it is consistently connected with the gift of salvation that is yet to be bestowed upon the believer by the goodness of God. For example, in Hebrews 4:16, "Let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need." Additionally, there are a lot of verses that differentiate God from Jesus in this epistle, like Hebrews 5:7. During the days of Jesus' life on earth, he offered up prayers and petitions with fervent cries and tears to the one who could save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverent submission. Here, Jesus is beseeching God with loud cries and tears. We can also ask ourselves the question, which verse is a scribe more likely to change? Are they more likely to change apart from God, a separationist view, to by the grace of God, or by the grace of God, a statement that no scribe should have an issue with, to apart from God? It is more likely that a scribe read the problematic words and changed them to something more agreeable than a scribe changed it to a more separationist view. We cannot explain the appearance of one without the other. But that's all for this time. Check us out on Facebook and Twitter, and if you like the content, please consider dropping a like and subscribing. And if you really love us, consider supporting us on Patreon. Make sure to click that bell to get notified when we make a video, and check out our new website. Be sure to share if you learned something, and we'll see you next time.